LTV, GMV, take rate, CAC, right? The world of marketplaces and metrics can get very confusing. And so even more confusing can be knowing what matters, right? We don't often think about that and why certain metrics are significant, how to use them. And Colin Gardiner is going to help us break this down. Colin, I couldn't think of anyone in the entire world better to talk about this topic than you. And I'm going to be honest with you, this is going to sound a little bit, maybe even disingenuous, but it's really not. I think you are my favorite person on LinkedIn to follow. I love the stuff you write, and super helpful for me. I've learned a ton from you. And so I'm really glad that you're here to talk about this. Clearly something you're passionate about. And so honestly, the best first place to start, just because we've got so much meat to get into, might just be to go ahead and say, why are you passionate about metrics for marketplaces?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually named my children LTV, CAC. No, I'm just joking. I didn't do that. My wife would kill me. But no, it's a good question. So I would say my journey into marketplaces has been inadvertent. Honestly, I graduated from college with econ math degrees, and I got hired to work at the Federal Reserve, and that was during the Great Recession. And I got hired to work at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Janet Yellen was leading that then. And I got put on the labor markets team. And so I basically got to study why all of my cohort of people of students and fellow students, were not getting jobs and what that meant. And so I always started with labor markets. And I got into tech, and the first company I went to was a marketplace. And I just literally since then, I've just been in marketplaces. And I kind of, the reason I love it is I tend to be a numbers person in general, and marketplaces are just infinitely quantifiable, right? And they just you can understand them from that perspective. And so I don't know, that's why I'm passionate about it. I love marketplaces. I love economic activity. I get excited about dollar signs and people making money. So that's why I like them.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, when you're managing multiple sides, like you would be in a marketplace with two or more sides, you're dealing with so much complexity, even just trying to balance them, trying to scale while keeping them precisely balanced. This is all that stuff is really confusing, and that's probably why people love you so much. It's because you make it not so confusing. And so maybe the best place to start would be for marketplace leaders to just hear, what are the most important metrics if I'm sitting in a C-level seat for me to be thinking about, to know how my marketplace is doing, and maybe to gauge what decisions I should be making?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it will change over time. I think early stage, you want to be understanding if you're getting any economic activity at all. And that goes back to GMV, right? Or gross revenue. And this really is understanding, is the marketplace getting any throughput? Is it providing any liquidity and therefore economic value to people that are using it, right? And that's a really good early indicator of, is my marketplace working? Now, great, you've produced some gross revenue and some GMV. Next, you start to care about, well, how much money am I actually making from that? What is my take rate? And then ultimately, what's my net revenue? That's kind of the next iteration, right? And then beyond that, you say, okay, great, I'm making this money, but how much margin am I making from this? Am I actually running a successful business? And so that goes to your, gross profit margin, and then ultimately your contribution margin. For every sale you make, right, on the marketplace, how much margin are you producing incrementally over time? And so those are the financial and revenue metrics that really matter. But in terms of the actual usage, a lot of what matters comes down to your marketplace ratio, your buyer seller ratio, things like that, measuring your liquidity in the marketplace. How likely is a transaction to occur, and are we able to convert interest into transactions? And are we getting responsiveness on our supply side to make a transaction occur? So those are some vital metrics. And then ultimately the holy grail, as you mentioned, the first part, is all kind of culminates in these output metrics of LTV and CAC, right? And ultimately that ratio, which tells you, one, your payback period, how fast you make your money back when you acquire a user, but then ultimately how much margin you make in the long run from acquiring these users. Those are kind of the holy grail metrics, and they're very hard to do early on because you don't have a lot of data around it. But as you get further along in your tenure as a business, you'll start to understand those things and understand, can this be a really big, awesome business?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love hearing you talk about ratios. Feel like ratios would probably be more relevant to marketplaces than many business. I mean, ratios are kind of always important, but that is a lot of the difference. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, because you're going to know this way better than me. But I feel like that's a lot of the difference between measuring in a marketplace, especially when you're often comparing two sides versus a lot of other kinds of businesses. I know that's really important. So I think maybe it'd be good just to break down some of those metrics that you've mentioned. You mentioned GMV, take rate, revenue, a lot of those things. And is there anything there that isn't easy to, like, someone couldn't just look up on Google and figure out how to measure that? Is there anything that you say, I kind of need to show them how to get to this number?
Yeah, I'd say all of them are easy to define, but they're not quite as easy to like actually go calculate, right? I think that's like the devil's always in the details. But I do think that, fairly well trodden from like GMV, take rate, net revenue, like people are pretty good in that range, right? But I do find that it's getting into the financial elements, like like how much margin are you producing, which what really matters in the long run, because that helps you understand, are you efficiently acquiring customers? Because you need to acquire both sides, right? It takes two to tango, and you really need to understand like how much you can pay to acquire both sides together, and then how much you produce from the transaction. And that's where like I think the devil's in the details a lot, right? It's like, how do you do that? What do you include in there? What's a fixed cost? What's a cost of goods sold? Like all of those things. And I think that's where I end up helping a lot of people, help them define that and get that really tight. And usually then that really enables them to like understand how the business is doing, and positions them well for future fundraising, but also for strategy. Like if you find out as we go through this process, oh, we're not producing as much margin as we need to, and we need to lower our cost of acquisition, then you have an immediately an important outcome that has to happen. You got to lower acquisition cost while still growing. How do we do that? And that kind of naturally leads to some of the most important things for marketplaces, which is typically like organic acquisition, right? Like that's an area where you really need to focus and nail early on, so that you can scale efficiently and not need crazy amounts of money to scale, because you don't have great unit economics up front.
That's good. I love hearing unit economics talked about in general, because I think unit economics gets overlooked a lot by especially early stage companies. And there's one word I haven't heard you mention yet that I know is probably a word that a lot of marketplace leaders are thinking, and it's liquidity. And at least I haven't heard you say that. Maybe you have said it and I missed it, but could you just define liquidity? Talk about how that is used in a marketplace, how you might measure it, and why that might be important for marketplace leaders to know about.
Of course. So liquidity in its like basic sense is, what is the probability of a transaction occurring, right? So when people say you have low liquidity, you have a low probability of a transaction occurring. Where you have high liquidity, right? You have a high probability of a transaction occurring. And realistically, what goes into making the probability go up? Well, usually increasing the number of buyers and sellers proportionately, right, will increase the liquidity, right? And so inherent in that, another ratio is the buyer to seller ratio, the marketplace ratio. And the question is that you kind of get at as you look at that metric is, how many buyers can one seller service, right, in a given time frame? And one way I like to think about this is like, if you have a service that takes you an hour and you only have 12 hours in the day to do it, as a seller, you can only do 12 to 1, right? Like that's your ratio, right? And that it's like no bathroom breaks, no eating, nothing, right? But realistically, maybe it's more like 8 to 10 to 1, right? That is like literally the buyer to seller ratio. And so as you add a piece of supply, that is like the maximum amount of buyers that you can service, right? And so that tells you about your liquidity too, is that if you add another incremental seller, you can start to add more buyers, right? And so as you add more sellers, you kind of increase the probability of transactions occurring. And so that's why liquidity is so important early on, to like add supply, and that you just see conversion rates and matching rate go up over time because you're adding supply. But realistically, you have to add enough supply as you bring in demand to like, meet that kind of buyer to seller ratio ceiling, right? So that you're not oversaturating your supply relative to how much demand you want. That's the fun of marketplaces. It's like, so.
Yeah, and that, I mean, you make it sound simple, I think liquidity could get even more complicated, right? Like we're
Oh yeah.
talking just direct buyer to seller, but like your former experience at Outdoorsy, you've got location thrown into that as well, and so like, there's all kinds of things that could get thrown in. And one interesting thing I think for marketplace leaders is it's easy, like you mentioned earlier, it's easy to know what to measure. It's harder to know how to measure it. And I think especially early stage, you're thinking, how do I build the systems to keep my finger on the pulse of a lot of these things? And instead of just like at the beginning of every week downloading every piece of data I have, throwing it in Excel and creating a bunch of pivot tables and charts. And so maybe it would be good for them to hear, how do I start early thinking about how I can set up to be able to keep my eye on these things well.
Yeah, I mean, I can't stress it enough that creating good analytics framework, like on-site reporting, whatever you have, and like a good practice around recording it is just like super important. It's like a muscle you have to build. And the companies that are religious about measurement tend to be very successful, right? Like they just,
Yep.
it's just like innate in them. And companies that don't do that can be successful. I won't say they won't. They hopefully learn over time to be more, like focused. I would say data driven. I'd say more focused on measurement, right? Like what is happening and understanding that. More of like a analytical driven mindset. But the ones that do have very good visibility, right? And marketplaces, again, they're not really, really complicated products per se, right? They're really about driving liquidity,
Mm-hmm.
and liquidity requires you to watch it, right? Like you need to understand what balances your marketplace, right? Like you said, maybe it's like you have geographic factors, maybe you have time of day factors, like there could be a bunch of different factors that matter, and measuring liquidity at those certain times is what matters. So for example, like let's say we had a Christmas tree marketplace, right? And I was like, Brooks, I've got great liquidity and it's July, right? Like I've got a ton of Christmas trees. Well, that doesn't really matter, right? Because no one's going to buy Christmas trees in July. When will they buy them? They'll buy them in December for sure, maybe a little bit in November, right? And so, what you're measuring there is like you need to measure liquidity basically from, let's say Thanksgiving to Christmas. That's all that matters. Like how much available inventory do you have in that time period, and can you satiate demand during that time period? And I think a lot of businesses have this similar like Christmas tree concept, right? Where, business like Outdoorsy, very seasonal summer business, right? Retail businesses very much around the holidays in terms of like marketplaces for e-commerce and things like that. So,
Mm-hmm.
you want to measure liquidity in the times that matter. And that's where I think if you're really analytical and you can define, and really hone in on the periods and times and things that matter, that's where you can be really successful. But the people that just kind of always take the broad look, they're going to have a hard time really optimizing their marketplaces and finding that wedge and that traction that springboards them.
That's really good. Really good stuff. Earlier you mentioned LTV and CAC, and I just mentally put a pin in that and was like, I think that's something we got to come back to later. I know this from reading your stuff, from talking to you. You believe LTV and CAC are often not measured correctly. And so I think it's important, because I love the concepts you've thrown out, to maybe talk about that. How would you advise marketplace leaders to measure those things? Or maybe
Yeah,
even better yet, what are the ways that we're doing this wrong?
yeah, I think a lot of like the basics of what I see is that people aren't internalizing that lifetime value is not lifetime revenue. It's actually lifetime margin, so to speak, right? Like how much value to the business are these customers creating over time? And so that's like the main thing is I see people using either the gross revenue or the net revenue number to calculate LTV. And I think that's fine at just to like understand, right? Like how much gross revenue will a customer produce in their lifetime? Good number to know, right? How much, net revenue will they produce over the lifetime? That's basically, the take rate. But ultimately, you also need to understand the margin the customer is going to produce over time. And that's why you have that ratio of LTV to CAC, because what it tells you is saying, hey, here's all the margin we produce relative to how much cost it acquire, how much it costs to us to acquire that customer. And if that number isn't at one, right, over time, you're, like in 2 and 3, like you're really not going to have like successful business over time, right? And that's kind of like, the canonical numbers are like 3 to 1 LTV to CAC ratio at 3 years, 5 to 1, 5 years. I don't like that conventional wisdom, because I think it's not necessarily applicable to every type of marketplace, and it really depends on the frequency, AOV, like the type of marketplace you have, and which side you're looking at or how you look at it. So I use it as a benchmark of like what good could be, but it's not like the holy grail. Like that's not like what you have to do to be successful, if that makes sense. I think the important thing though with this is like to measure the margin though. Like I think that is like the key part, because that tells you like, are we producing positive unit economics over time after the cost of acquiring a customer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the more I hear about this, the more I'm just thinking marketplaces can be so unique. Each individual marketplace could have different. You have different things to consider from others and how you're measuring a lot of these things. I think that's a really important piece of this, is understanding your own marketplace, understanding what might be important to you, and thinking well through that. Regarding LTV and CAC, I know one thing you've mentioned is that many marketplaces aren't doing two-sided LTV and CAC, and I'm curious what you mean by that, and what it looks like to do it right.
Yeah. So what we mean by that is, there's two sides of the marketplace, right? A transaction does not occur without both sides, right? And so if you're doing just LTV to CAC on one side of the marketplace and saying like that's it, like it looks good, it's not really accounting for the other side. Like how much did it cost? Like if you're doing the demand side and you say, oh great, we have positive economics, we made X amount of money on the demand side and it cost us this much to acquire them, and you're not factoring in the cost of acquiring the supply, you're kind of telling the wrong story, right? And I do see some people can kind of do it somewhat successfully of like, maybe it's like the demand side fee over how much it costs to acquire them, or like the supply side fee over the cost to acquire them. And you can kind of do it that way. But what that doesn't tell you over time is like holistically, if we acquire a customer and like we look at either from a supply or demand perspective, like what does it cost to acquire that customer? And then what does it cost to acquire all of the demand or supply for it? So let's do a quick example. Let's do a supply side marketplace. So let's just say we've got like Airbnb, for example, like we acquire a homeowner that has a house, maybe multiple houses, but let's just say it has a house. It costs us X amount of dollars to do that. And we make this amount of LTV over the lifetime. The issue with that is like, you're not accounting for the cost of acquiring all the demand to create the LTV that they had. And so what you need to do is add to it the cost of acquiring all the demand for that owner set. Like how much did it cost to acquire all those bookings for them over time? And what's tricky about that is like, most businesses, like they unit economics don't look good day one, right? But they get a lot better over time. And that means their like gross profit or contribution margin improves over time, as does their like CAC, right? And so to calculate it really well, you kind of have to waterfall it over time. And that's a little bit of a tricky exercise for companies, especially early stage ones that may not have expertise in modeling or things like that. And so that's a lot of where I help people is like, how do we visualize this? How do we set this up in like a useful way? And I've created templating around this to help, because that's what's helpful is like, here's how the framework, right? And it's something the only way I learned all of this was through multiple marketplaces, raising like, $200 million plus in dollars, and doing pitching and like doing diligence with investors where they were like, what's your LTV to CAC? And getting a lot of feedback from them, doing it wrong up front and getting it right by the end in a lot of ways. But that's how I learned, is like a lot of smart people giving me feedback on how to visualize the business. And, honestly, everyone does it a little bit different. And I think I've tried to coalesce a lot of that into kind of a relatively standard framework for which people like will accept it. So anyway, that's part of my goal, I think, with marketplaces in general, is like, and just helping people is like, how can we get to like more of a unified standard of how to do this, such that it isn't like this like question mark or like witchcraft and wizardry of how you do it. So
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I'm not a huge fan of things I think are too often said. Like in business, you hear a lot about, this meeting was kind of a fire hose, but I can't think of a better way to describe this conversation that we just had For at least for me, there's so much good stuff that you shared, Colin. So I really appreciate that, and it just was rapid fire. And so
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could sum this up by saying, of all the things we've talked about in the last 20 minutes, what is the biggest takeaway that you would want marketplace leaders to have?
Yeah, I think there's like the generalized startup advice I would give people, having done a number of them myself. I think you know it's never as good as it seems. It's never as bad as it seems, and that you just got to stay even building, and it'll come together. But overall, for like marketplaces specifically, you know, I think they're all so different, right? I think one of the things I would give people is that advice is somewhat dangerous because everything is so unique, and that you need to find your own truths within how your marketplace works. And that just because that's the way Airbnb or Uber or Colin said it was, does not mean that's the way it's going to be done in the future. And I strongly believe that. I think there's like some well-trodden paths of like things that you should know, like what are good metric ratios, like, to understand what good is, or like understanding that certain acquisition channels, like low cost is like really important over time, just given how these marketplaces work. But how you go about it, write your own playbook, man, because that's what the marketplaces are all about. It's like, how can you be effective at acquiring supply and demand in a unique and cheap way such that you can outrun competition and do it faster than everybody else? That's what I recommend.
Yeah, there's no one size fits all playbooks. That's a huge thing I think we talked about on this podcast a lot, because it's really a necessary thing to hear, I think, over and over again. That's really good. Well, if you, like me, felt like you drank through a fire hose in this, one of my biggest suggestions to you would be go follow Colin on LinkedIn. Follow, take rate your, would you call it a blog or newsletter?
I don't know. It's somewhere in between, but it gets mail. It gets sent to you over email, so I guess we call it newsletter.
Sure. Yeah, I really enjoy getting them. It breaks this stuff down so well. And so just go start looking at the stuff he's putting out. I couldn't recommend it more. And Colin, if there's anything specific that you'd like us to link to promote, feel free to let me know now, and I'll go ahead and add that into the show notes here, and so that our audience can go check out the show notes and find links to all this relevant stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely come read my content and join the newsletter at GardnerColin.com. I do have my own advising consulting businesses exclusively on marketplaces that it's called Karta Labs. And then I do a fun angel investing podcast as well. So I've been in Brooks's shoes, where I get the fire hose the other way, called Wannabe Angels, that I do with Harry Cambell, the Rideshare Guy. And we do that weekly. And it's all talking to early stage angel investors and learning from the best.
That's awesome. All right, my friend. Well, thank you so much for joining. Thanks for sharing so much with this group. I'm sure there will be more questions after, and but I'm also sure anyone who listened to this is walking away going, I just got something gold to take back. And so I'm really grateful for that. Colin, thanks for joining, taking the time to do it. And anytime you want to come back on, you're always welcome.
My pleasure. I may take you up on that.
All right, perfect. All right, audience, thank you guys for listening, being part of the community. If you have comments, thoughts, questions, we're, of course, always willing to hear. And so put those wherever you'd like to. If it's the comments, if it's LinkedIn, if it's through a contact form on the website, we'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we'll catch you in the next episode.